This lecture is on discrimination. First, I examine the meaning of job discrimination, and then the evidence, both in terms of statistics and in terms of the attitudes of companies and individuals, which suggests that job discrimination is a continuing problem. I conclude by discussing how our society has responded to this problem. The meaning of job discrimination. To discriminate in employment is to make an adverse decision regarding an employee or a job applicant based on his or her membership in a certain group. More specifically, job discrimination occurs when 1. An employment decision in some way harms or disadvantages an employee or a job applicant. 2. The decision is based on the person's membership in a certain group rather than on individual merit. And 3. The decision rests on prejudice, false stereotypes, or the assumption that the group in question is in some way inferior and thus does not deserve equal treatment. Because historically, most discrimination in the American workplace has been aimed at women and a minority such as African Americans and Hispanics, I focus on those groups. Job discrimination can take different forms. It can be individual or institutional, and can be either intentional or unwitting. Individuals, for instance, sometimes intentionally discriminate out of personal prejudice or on the basis of stereotypes. For example, an executive at Rent-A-Center, the nation's largest rent-to-own furniture and home appliance company, purposely disregarded job applications from women because he believed that they, quote, should be home taking care of their husbands and children. On the other hand, individuals may discriminate because they unthinkingly or unconsciously accept traditional practices or stereotypes. For example, suppose that the merit pay recommendations of a Walmart manager are influenced by his implicit assumption that male employees are career-oriented and have families to support, whereas female employees are there just to make a little extra money. If the manager is unaware that this bias affects his decisions, his actions would fall into this category. Institutions can also discriminate. Sometimes they do so explicitly and intentionally. For example, employment agencies that screen out African Americans, Latinos, older workers, and others at the request of their corporate clients. Or the Shoney's restaurants that color-coded job applications that separate blacks from whites and that directed blacks, if hired, into kitchen jobs so they would not be seen from the dining room. On the other hand, the routine operating procedures of a company may reflect stereotypes and prejudiced practices that it is not fully aware of. That seems to have been the case at Abercrombie & Fitch, which paid $50 million to settle a class action job discrimination lawsuit against it. The suit charged that in trying to cultivate its distinctive retail image, the company put minorities in less visible jobs and hired a disproportionately white sales force. Or, to take another example, for years the FBI routinely transferred its Hispanic agents around the country on temporary low-level assignments where knowledge of Spanish was needed. The agents functioned as little more than assistants to non-Hispanic colleagues. Hispanic agents dubbed this the taco circuit and claimed that it adversely affected their opportunities for promotion. A federal court agreed with them that the practice was indeed discriminatory. In addition, institutional practices that appear neutral and non-discriminatory may harm members of groups that have been traditionally discriminated against. When membership in an all-white crafts union, for instance, requires nomination by those who are already members, racial exclusion is likely to result, even if the motivation of those who do the nominating is purely nepotistic and results from no racially motivated ill will or stereotyping. Similarly, when U.S. Air had a special backdoor hiring channel for pilots recommended by employees or friends of the company, only white pilots were ever hired this way. Although the policy may look racially neutral, its outcome was biased. Institutional procedures like these may not involve job discrimination in the narrow sense, but they clearly work to the disadvantage of women and minority groups, denying them full equality of opportunity. From a variety of moral perspectives, there are compelling moral arguments against job discrimination on racial or sexual grounds. Since discrimination involves false assumptions about the inferiority of a certain group and harms individual members of that group, Utilitarians would reject it because of its ill effects on total human welfare. Kantians would clearly repudiate it as failing to respect people as ends in themselves. Universalizing the maxim underlying discriminatory practices is virtually impossible. No people who discriminate would be willing to accept such treatment themselves. Discrimination on grounds of sex or race also violates people's basic moral rights and mocks the ideal of human moral equality. Furthermore, such discrimination is unjust. To use Rawls's theory as an illustration, parties in the original position would clearly choose for themselves the principle of equal opportunity. On the other hand, there are no respectable arguments in favor of racial and sexual discrimination. Whatever racist or sexist attitudes people might actually have, no one today is prepared to defend job discrimination publicly, any more than that someone would publicly defend slavery or repealing the right of women to vote. This attitude toward job discrimination is reflected in legal and political efforts to develop programs to root it out and to ameliorate the results of past discrimination. Before discussing this, though, let's look at the evidence that suggests job discrimination continues to be a real problem. Evidence of discrimination. When investigators sent equally qualified young white and black men, all of them articulate and conventionally dressed, to apply for entry-level jobs in Chicago and Washington, D.C., the results clearly showed racial discrimination against the young African American men. Subsequent studies have confirmed that result. In fact, one of them found that white applicants were more successful than black applicants even when they had criminal records, and the otherwise identical blacks did not. Similarly, Hispanics and African Americans are more likely to be turned down for home mortgages or to pay higher interest rates than are whites at the same income level. The same is true for auto loans. And a study has shown that if you work for the federal government, you're more likely to be fired if you're black, regardless of your job status, experience, or education. In fact, race is more important in predicting who gets fired than job performance ratings or even prior disciplinary history. Job discrimination certainly exists, but determining how widespread it is isn't easy. However, when 1, statistics indicate that women and minorities play an unequal role in the workplace, and 2, endemic attitudes, practices, and policies are biased in ways that seem to account for the skewed statistics, then there's good reason to believe that job discrimination is a pervasive problem. Statistical evidence. Let's look first at the statistical evidence. According to UN figures, white Americans have the highest standard of living in the world. African Americans, however, come in only 31st, and Hispanics 35th. Life expectancy for blacks, moreover, is lower than it is for whites, and blacks are twice as likely to die from disease, accident, and homicide. Racial minorities also bear the brunt of poverty in our nation. African Americans are about 3 times more likely to be poor than are whites, whereas 1 in 10 white Americans lives in poverty. 1 out of every 4 or 5 African Americans and Hispanics is poor. Today, a black child has 1 chance in 3 of being born into poverty. The median wealth of white households today is more than 10 times that of Hispanic or African American households. $86,370 versus $7,932 for Hispanics and $5,988 for African Americans. In line with this, the rate of home ownership is 50% greater for white households than for black or Hispanic households. At the same time, the median income of African American families is only 2/3, and that of Hispanic families only 3/4 the median income of white households. Unemployment also hits racial minorities hard. Compared with whites, they are twice as likely to be out of work. About 40% of working African Americans hold white-collar jobs, up from 11% in 1960. But black workers with an advanced degree earn 25% less than whites with the same education. Moreover, black and other minority workers still tend to be clustered in low-paying, low-prestige, dead-end work. United States government statistics reveal clearly the extent to which the most desirable occupations in professional and technical jobs, management, and administration are dominated by whites. Blacks, Hispanics, and other ethnic minorities are relegated to less desirable jobs in manual labor, service, and farm work. African Americans, for instance, make up less than 11% of the workforce, but they constitute 1/4 to 1/3 of the nation's barbers, bus and taxi drivers, garbage collectors, and security guards. In contrast, only 1.7% of commercial pilots, 2.6% of architects, 3.3% of psychologists, and 5.9% of all managers are black. Women, too, are clustered in poorer-paying jobs, the so-called pink-collar professions. They tend to work as librarians, nurses, elementary school teachers, sales clerks, secretaries, bank tellers, and waitresses, jobs that generally pay less than traditionally male occupations, such as an electrician, plumber, auto mechanic, shipping clerk, or truck driver. In the real world of work, the top-paying occupations have been, and to a large extent continue to be, almost exclusively male preserves. For example, 98.8% of dental hygienists, but less than 1/4 of dentists are women. It's not surprising then that 80% of working women earn less than $25,000 per year, although 2/5 of them are the sole head of a household. Even when women do the same work as men, they make less money. In fact, according to a General Accounting Office report, since 1995, the pay difference between full-time female managers and their male counterparts has increased in 7 of the 10 industries that collectively employ 71% of all female workers. For example, in entertainment and recreation, female managers now earn only 62% for each dollar earned by males. In finance, insurance, and real estate, it's 68 cents, and in retail trade, 65 cents. In education and in hospital medical services, women managers have done better. Their earnings have increased to 91 and 85%, respectively, of what men make. The across-the-board wage gap between men and women shrank during the 1980s, but has since leveled off, with women who work full-time continuing to take home, on average, less than 75% of what men make. And 1/3 of the women polled in a recent survey complained that they do not receive equal pay at their current jobs. In recent decades, both women and minorities have made considerable inroads into white-collar and professional ranks, but few have made it to the very top of their professions, as a glance at the companies that make up the Fortune 500 confirms. At these companies, women account for only 8% of those who have reached the level of executive vice president or higher, and they constitute only 5% of those who rank among their company's top 5 earners. The situation for blacks is no better, a fact that is powerfully illuminated by one simple statistic. Until Franklin Raines became CEO of Fannie Mae in 1999, no African American had ever been in charge of a Fortune 500 company. Attitudinal evidence. Although some might disagree, statistics alone do not conclusively establish discrimination, because one can always argue that other things account for the disparities in income and position between men and women and between whites and other races. But when widespread attitudes and institutional practices and policies are taken into account, they point to discrimination as a significant cause of the statistical disparities. Take the case of Bari Ellen Roberts. She left an $80,000 a year job at Chase Manhattan Bank to join Texaco's finance department. Soon after she arrived, Roberts found herself subjected to demeaning racial comments from colleagues and superiors. For example, one referred to her as a little colored girl. They couldn't understand why Roberts found such remarks offensive. A report on diversity that she and some other black employees were asked to prepare was summarily dismissed with a comment, "The next thing you know, we'll have Black Panthers running down the halls." And a supervisor downgraded her performance record because he thought she was, quote, uppity. Fed up with this, she and several other black employees filed a discrimination suit citing, quote, the poisonous racial atmosphere, end quote, at Texaco. Texaco settled the suit for $141 million in retroactive raises after the news media got hold of a tape recording of an executive strategy session at Texaco. In the meeting, one official referred to black employees as black jelly beans, saying, quote, "This diversity thing, you know how all the black jelly beans stick together." To which another responded, quote, "That's funny. All the black jelly beans seem to be stuck at the bottom of the bag." One of Robert's supervisors said, "I can't punch her in the face, so I play mind games with her." The executives were also heard agreeing to shred incriminating personnel records. In several other cases that were well publicized, suits by professional women have exposed discriminatory attitudes and policies at law firms, accounting firms, and brokerage houses. In the case of Nancy Isolde, the judge found that the prominent Philadelphia law firm for which she worked had applied tougher standards to women seeking partnerships than to men. Isolde said, quote, "It wasn't just that similarly situated men were treated better than me," which is the double standard idea. Another thing that came out of the trial was that in the year preceding the partnership decision, the firm assigned me to less complex cases and to fewer partners than it did men, so that I was denied the exposure that was critical to the partnership decision, end quote. In the case of Ann Hopkins, sex stereotyping was at the root of the discrimination. Though she was considered an outstanding worker, Price Waterhouse denied her a partnership because she was allegedly an abrasive and overbearing manager. Co-workers referred to her as macho, advised her to go to charm school, and intimated that she was overcompensating for being a woman. One partner in the firm even told her that she should, quote, "walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely, wear makeup, have her hair styled, and wear jewelry," end quote. Hopkins argued, and the court agreed, that comments like these revealed an underlying sexism at the firm, and her strident manner and occasional cursing would have been overlooked if she had been a man. The same was true in the case of Allison Schifflin, a bond dealer who complained of pay discrimination at Morgan Stanley. Her firm claimed she was insubordinate, verbally abusive, and, quote, physically threatening. But it's unlikely that it would have held her hard-driving temperament against her if she had been a man. The case of Elizabeth Hishon, who sued a large Atlanta law firm after she failed to win a partnership, is noteworthy because the defendants expressed no specific complaints about her work. They apparently denied Hishon a partnership based on a general feeling, quote, that she just didn't fit in. In the words of another woman who had been an associate at the firm, quote, "If you can't discuss the Virginia-North Carolina basketball game, you're an outcast." Her pithy comment speaks volumes about how deep-seated attitudes operate against women and minorities in the workplace. Women entering male turf, or minority workers of either sex going into a predominantly white work environment, can find themselves uncomfortably being measured by a white male value system. At large companies, for instance, 42% of female executives and 34% of male minority executives report feeling constrained by the white male model, consciously and continually editing themselves to look, sound, and act like their white male counterparts. Over the years, surveys have revealed that sex stereotyping and sexist assumptions are widespread in business. Male managers frequently assume that women place family demands among work considerations, that they lack the necessary drive to succeed in business, that they take negative feedback personally rather than professionally, and that they are too emotional to be good managers. Even worse, researchers have found that women internalize many of the stereotypes that men have of them as less effective leaders, despite the well-established fact that there's little difference between the leadership styles of successful male and female bosses. When it comes to race, the stereotypes can be even more damaging. For example, a survey shows that 3 out of 4 whites believe that African Americans and Hispanics are more likely than whites to prefer living on welfare. And a majority of whites also believe that African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be lazy, unpatriotic, and prone to violence. And many whites, even well-educated ones, still accept the canard that blacks are less intelligent than whites. Myths, stereotypes, false preconceptions, and biased attitudes victimize both women and minorities in the world of work, leading to decisions that disadvantage them in all aspects of their careers. This is especially true when companies give managers too much discretion in hiring, task assignment, promotion, and pay. In such circumstances, according to Professor William T. Bilby, all people unknowingly revert to stereotypes in making judgments. Quote, "The tendency to invoke gender stereotypes in making judgments about people is rapid and automatic. As a result, people are unaware of how stereotypes affect their perceptions and behavior, including individuals whose personal beliefs are relatively free of prejudice." End quote. Commenting on racial stereotypes, business consultant Edward W. Jones Jr. states, quote, "All people possess stereotypes, which act like shorthand to avoid mental overload. Most of the time, stereotypes are mere shadow images rooted in one's history and deep in the subconscious, but they are very powerful. For example, in controlled experiments, the mere insertion of the word black into a sentence has resulted in people changing their responses to a statement." End quote. Taken together with the statistics, the attitudes, assumptions, and practices I have been reviewing provide powerful evidence of ongoing discrimination against women and minorities in the American workplace. Recognizing the existence of such discrimination and believing for a variety of reasons that is wrong, we have as a nation passed laws to provide equality of opportunity to women and minorities. The response to discrimination. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Brown versus Board of Education that racially segregated schooling is unconstitutional. That famous decision helped to launch the civil rights movement in this country. One fruit of that movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits all forms of discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Title VII of the Act specifically outlaws discrimination in employment. The Civil Rights Act applies to all employers, both public and private, with 15 or more employees. In 1967, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act was passed, and in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act extended to people with disabilities the same rights to equal employment opportunities that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guarantees to women and minorities. In addition, several acts and executive orders regulate government contractors and subcontractors and require equal employment opportunities for veterans. All these acts are enforced through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. The laws I've been discussing expressly forbid discrimination in recruitment, screening, promotion, compensation, and firing. But anti-discrimination laws do not address the present-day effects of past discrimination. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, companies contracting with the federal government were required to develop affirmative action programs designed to correct imbalances in employment that exist as a result of past discrimination. Other government organizations and many private companies have followed suit. These programs correspond with the court's recognition that job discrimination can exist even in the absence of conscious intent to discriminate. Affirmative action programs generally involve the organizations designing strategies for remedying underrepresentation of women and minorities inside the organization and setting itself targets and timetables for doing so. We saw earlier that Texaco was forced to pay its black employees $141 million, the largest race discrimination settlement in history, because the company had discriminated against qualified African Americans by refusing to promote them or pay them comparable salaries. It has also retaliated against those who asserted their civil rights. Lawsuits have exposed discriminatory pay practices at many other companies, including Mitsubishi, Home Depot, Merrill Lynch, American Express, Walmart, and Boeing. Other firms are guilty of ignoring the spirit of equal employment opportunity, even if they don't violate the letter of the law. For example, some companies forbid their employees from speaking Spanish among themselves, even when their jobs do not require English proficiency or dealing with the public. Other companies have not made a serious effort to expand employment opportunities for women or minorities. Yet today, most large companies not only accept the necessity of affirmative action, but also find that the bottom line benefits when they make themselves more diverse. Because 4/5 of those entering the workforce today are minorities or immigrants, affirmative action expands the pool of talent from which corporations can recruit. It also allows them to reach out to a demographically wider customer base. Between now and 2020, most new customers will be minorities, and thus makes them better able to compete both in the global marketplace and in an increasingly multicultural environment at home. United Parcel Service, for example, credits its commitment to diversity for its high customer satisfaction ratings. And Nicole Bard, a network manager, Intel Corporation, says, quote, "We view diversity as one of our major competitive advantages. It allows us to understand global markets and the needs of our customers." As Christine A. Edwards, Chief Legal Officer at Bank One, puts it, quote, "Diversity is good business." However, despite the strong business case for diversity, genuine equality of opportunity has yet to be achieved in the corporate world. According to a National Urban League survey, only 32% of employees believe that their companies do a decent job of hiring and promoting people other than white males. And most executives agree with them. Only 47% of them think their company's own diversity efforts are working. Despite the fact that most large corporations seek to make themselves more diverse, many Americans oppose affirmative action, and political opposition to it, especially to government affirmative action programs, has grown greater than ever. Critics of affirmative action charge that, in practice, it can mean illegal quotas, preferential treatment of African Americans and women, and even reverse discrimination against white men. For their part, proponents of affirmative action not only emphasize the importance of diversity, they also argue that affirmative action is a matter of social justice towards groups that have historically been discriminated against, that affirmative action is necessary to ensure that job competition is fair, and that is the only realistic way to break the cycle that keeps minorities and women locked into low-paying, low-prestige jobs. This is a big debate, which I don't have time to discuss here, but it clearly points to some of the unresolved moral problems that we have inherited from our society's sad history of discrimination, and that business and other organizations must address today.